Now I went to the Gus Alex trial, and his sentencing as well. It was one of the first trials I ever went to. And his nephew told me that Gussie underestimated the prosecution in their case. He felt no jury in the world would ever believe a scumbag like Lenny Patrick. He had all the connections, all the money in the world. He could have easily went to Greece or Europe and never been found again. Unfortunately, the jury believed Lenny Patrick and found him guilty. After the verdict was read, Gus Alex was taken into custody immediately. He took out a couple $1,000s out of his pocket, told his lawyer to give it to his Shotzi, his Swedish model girlfriend. He had a little tear in his eye, wiped his tear. He was given 15 years in prison and had to pay $800,000. He ended up dying in jail. Now, after the jury agreed that Gus Alex conspired with Lenny Patrick and his violent extortion crew, they found him guilty based on Lenny Patrick's lies. But this is where Gussie ended up, in a federal prison, and ended up dying at 86 years old. Gussie underestimated the prosecution. Now, one of my favorite outfit guys, Rocky and Felice, during his sentencing, he came out in an orange prison jumpsuit. You could tell he was pissed. He was making racial comments because the judge was black. And he went on to say that he was a World War II paratrooper. He fought against one of Hitler's toughest regimes. He didn't have a fair trial, and how she could cut him some slack. Now, Rocky and his crew were charged with murdering Hal Smith, one of the largest bookies in the United States, who was already paying the outfit. But they demanded more. He refused to pay. He ended up trunk music. B.J. Jehoda was an associate of the Rocky and Felice crew, lied on the stand and cooperated, and ended up convicting him. Now here's one tough cookie, Judge Ann Williams, a federal judge that presided over the Lollipop trial, and she ended up sentencing Rocky and Felice to what turned out to be life in prison. She actually scolded him, said that he was definitely a danger to society, and he had no right playing God, picking and choosing on who lives and dies, and she gave him the maximum she could. Now, believe it or not, when the verdict's read or during the sentencing, sometimes I don't like to be there. It's just a little too personal at those times, but yet very interesting. And I remember during the large trial, him and his family were kind of caught off guard that the judge took him into custody. I guess they felt he was a flight risk. His wife and daughter kind of yelled out at the judge. Mike started to speak, and he eventually started crying before they took him in. Now here's Judge Ron Guzman. He presides over most of the trials at the Dirksen Federal Building. He sat in and sentenced Mike Large Sarno, and he played it really cool with Large. He allowed him out on bond during the trial. He allowed him and his family to go to a nice Italian steakhouse. He even allowed him to cater in food from La Scarola. But at the end, he took him into custody and gave him 25 years for the bombing. Now, Joey's sentencing was pretty sad to see. He came out in a wheelchair in a blue prison suit. He basically denied to Judge Zagel that he had anything at all to do with Danny Seifert's murder. He said he felt sorry for Mrs. Seifert's loss back then. He feels sorry for the Seifert family now, and that you're convicting an innocent man. Joey ended up dying in prison at 90. Now, during Joey's sentencing, Joey went on to tell the judge how his mind, his body were failing him. He needed major dental work done. He had severe migraines. He had throat cancer. He had a gallbladder procedure. He had a few stents put in, and that they're trying to convict an innocent man, and he had nothing to do with Danny Seifert being killed. Now here lies Danny Seifert after he was shotgun blasted to death. It was either Tony Spilotro or Joey Hansen. He actually broke free when Frankie Schweiss and Tony Spilotro tried to handcuff him. Allegedly, Joey Lombardo was the other masked gunman that took Mrs. Seifert and little Joey into the room and held them at gunpoint. Now, during the Joey Lombardo sentencing, the Seiferts, they did a nice PowerPoint photo slide presentation in memory of Danny Seifert with the Beatles song playing in the background. And it was really done well. I remember seeing all three of them in court every day. I felt so sorry for their loss. And I'll never forget Mrs. Seifert testifying that Joey was one of the masked gunmen that day. Now, during the Jimmy Marcello sentencing, the judge agreed with the jury and found him guilty of killing the Spilotro brothers, gave him life in prison, even though the jury thought Jimmy didn't kill Nicholas DeAndrea. The judge overruled that, agreed with Marcus Funk, found him guilty of that crime as well. He gave Michael, his brother, 8 years and said Michael was guilty of being a loyal brother to his brother Jimmy. Now here's your Honorable Federal Judge James Zagel, appointed by President Ronald Reagan. He's known as a hanging judge as well as a fair judge. And he told Joey Lombardo that he found him charming, however, that we all have to pay for our sins, and sentenced Joey basically to a life in prison. Now here's James Marcello, first time ever laid eyes on him, going back to the early 90s with the Sam Carlisi trial. All the defendants were found guilty. At the end of that trial, when they asked, do you have anything to say? He said, the only reason I'm standing here in front of you, Your Honor, is because of my last name that ends in a vowel. Judge gave him 12 years. Can anybody explain to me how Jimmy Marcello got sent to the ADX Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, as well as Joey Lombardo, who was sent there to die? They claim because one or two of these men threatened Judge James Zagel. I don't know if I believe that. Men like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, El Chapo, and Al Qaeda are locked up here. Now, I'll never forget at the small packed Cook County courtroom at 26 in California, Frankie Jr.'s sentencing. Him and his friends beat up Leonard Clark years ago, and his father, Frank Sr., got a chance to speak to the judge, and man, he let the judge have it. I never heard anybody speak to a judge like that. He was raising his voice, yelling how his son didn't get a fair trial because of the media, how his family showed remorse, and his son should be given a break. Now, here's one of many Cook County judges, Daniel Locallo. And it's true, he did have beef with Frank Toots Caruso Sr. prior, and he led that beef into Frankie Jr.'s sentencing after Frank Caruso told him off in the courtroom and belittled him. It fell on deaf ears. The judge ended up giving Frankie Caruso 8 years in jail. I will never forget seeing this man in court at his trial and also in shackles at his sentencing. He was convicted for 3 armed robberies back in 2008. Judge Evans gave him 62 years in prison, which turned out to be a life sentence. He told the judge, I came into this world as a man, and I'll leave this world as a man. He worked for Jimmy I and was the prime suspect in the Hatches murder. Now, out of all the defendants, I felt they had the least amount against Nick Ferriola. He was very smart, though. He kept his mouth shut. He listened to his lawyers and pled guilty. During the sentencing, Judge Zagel said that he had to be very well liked, very well trusted to get in so close and so tight with Frank Calabrese and the guys. He lectured him on his drinking, gave him 3 years in prison, and he had to pay a couple $100,000 in fines. Now, in Chicago, we have a saying, You can get pulled over for a broken taillight. Next minute you know, you're confessing to a murder. I went to the trial and sentencing of notorious police commander and Vietnam veteran John Burge. Him and his crew allegedly tortured over 100 black men into false confessions. Because the statute of limitations expired, they only charged him with one count of perjury for lying to the FBI. This man showed no remorse at all for his crimes. Now here's poor Judge Joan Lefkow. We all know the tragedy when some maniac showed up at her doorstep and actually killed her husband, who was probably there to kill her. But anyway, she presided over the sentencing of John Burge. Because of the statute of limitations, they couldn't charge him for torture, but they charged him for lying to the FBI, and she gave him 4.5 years. Now, I went to both Blago trials and the sentencing. There was his big mouth and all the taped conversations they had, plus his lavish lifestyle. I mean, he spent $400,000 in clothes. And at the end, he showed no remorse at all. He pissed off Judge Zagel. Judge James Zagel gave him 14 years in prison. Trump gave him a full pardon. Years later, he came in brown. He went out gray.